I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we're following Prime Minister Keir Starmer's first official visit to Kyiv and the 100-year partnership deal he's bringing with him. And we talk about a UN report that investigates alleged violations and abuses of human rights in the war against Ukraine by Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 16th of January, 2 years and 321 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dom Nicholls, former tank commander and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, and later in the episode, France's Dearnley, with an interview recorded during our trip to Kyiv a couple of months ago.
Yeah, hi Adélie, hi everybody. Into Ukraine last night, drones, 34 of 55 shot down, 18 others were brought down because of electronic warfare. Attacks across the country killed 4, injured many others around a number of oblasts, mostly in Kherson. The governor, Alexander Prokudin in Kherson, said that Russian forces had targeted 36 settlements across the whole of Kherson Oblast, including the city itself. 3 people killed and 10 injured there. Now, there's images on social media of a civilian car that was hit by a drone, with reports saying that was being driven by civilians at the time. Suggestions that's part of this ongoing so-called human safari that we've been reporting for months now. Blatant war crime. Freelance journalist Tim White, worth a follow, worth buying him a coffee. Have a look at him on Twitter. He's calling it the transport terror. He says the transport terror is continuing with another marshrutka, that's a shared taxi service, hit by a drone. Now, on the ground in Ukraine, minimal movement across the front, small Russian gains to the southwest of Pokrovsk, 30 k's-ish south from there in the vicinity of Kudakov. About another 30 k's or so southwest of that is Velika Novosilka. That's been under extreme pressure for weeks now. Russia has gained ground in the last 24 hours to the southwest of that. The town is looking extremely vulnerable at the moment. Now, no change in Kursk Oblast in Russia, although Ukraine's airborne assault troops press service said this morning that during recent hostilities they had captured 27 Russian service members from motorized rifle units, from Marines, airborne troops and other units coming from various Russian regions and the occupied city of Sevastopol in Crimea. Now, elsewhere, the first prisoner of war exchange in 2025 took place yesterday. It was mediated by the United Arab Emirates. 25 personnel were exchanged by both sides. The Ukrainian Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War said that the 25 returned to Ukraine included a civilian. As I said the other day, I'm not entirely sure what that means, as in why would you be a prisoner of war as a civilian unless you're from the dark side? I don't know. Now, you may remember Ukrainian Human Rights Commissioner Dmitry Lubinets, speaking on January the 6th, said that Ukraine and Russia had then reached a preliminary agreement to conduct regular prisoner of war exchanges throughout this year. And Ukraine at the time said they were going to prioritise trying to get back all their seriously ill and wounded people. Most of that reporting is from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. Now, the last one for me, and it is a bit long, so please bear with me on this one. But I think this is very important. Thank you to Saul and Marie, communications officers at the United Nations, for pointing me towards this. It was a statement from the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, delivered by Commissioner Pavlo de Greiff to the Security Council on Monday of this week. So, a quick recap. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine was set up in March 2022 to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights, violations of international humanitarian law, and related crimes in the war against Ukraine by Russia. They provide regular updates and reports to the Security Council and the General Assembly and other UN bodies. Now, when we talk about human rights violations, the Russian narrative, basically the Russian disinformation that we often see, is that any reports of alleged Russian human rights violations are all made up. And they keep saying, you should get an independent body, blah, 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 to go and report. Well, this is the UN, right? So there is no more independent body. So it is worth listening to what they have to say. I'm going to quote extensively from Commissioner Pablo de Grief's report from Monday. We'll put a link in the episode notes, but I should warn you, there is graphic content for about the next 2 or 3 minutes. So if you want to come back in a couple of minutes, that's no problem at all. So this is a quote, direct quote from Pablo de Grief to the Security Council. The Commission has reiterated repeatedly its deep concern regarding the widespread and systematic use of torture by the Russian Federation against civilians and prisoners of war. In our October 2024 report to the General Assembly, we concluded that Russian authorities have committed torture as a coordinated state policy and hence crimes against humanity. We reached this conclusion after gathering evidence for over 2.5 years concerning multiple patterns in the way Russian authorities committed torture in all regions of Ukraine where they took control of territories and in detention facilities in 8 regions of the Russian Federation. We found that different services and security forces of the Russian Federation have acted in a coordinated manner in the commission of torture. We documented some of the most violent treatment during interrogations, including severe and repeated beatings, sessions of electric shocks with wires attached to various parts of the detainees' bodies, at times in combination with water to amplify the effects of the electricity, burns and suffocation. In large detention facilities, detainees are subjected collectively to long periods of forced nudity, intrusive body searches and attacks on genital organs through beatings and electric shocks with tasers, including in the showers as they are naked and wet. We also documented individual acts of rape and attempted rape, electric shocks using wires and burns to the genital area, castration and sexual mutilation. Male former detainees reported intentional attacks on their reproductive organs. For instance, a perpetrator told a former detainee, "I will beat everything out of you so you cannot make children." Others shared similar experiences. Medical care is generally denied in detention facilities, even in situations where detainees had serious, visible or life-threatening injuries. In some instances, this led to death or severe and irreversible medical complications. Now to one of the most painful parts of my statement, the profound and long-lasting impact of the violations on the victims and their families. Former prisoners described the severe physical and psychological consequences they have had to endure after recurrent torture, often with long-term complications, including disability. Many still suffer from pain and trauma, citing broken bones and teeth, bleeding, swelling and infected or gangrened body parts, difficulties breathing, walking and sleeping, poor eyesight, and damage to various organs. Many of the victims found their reintegration into social and even family life to be particularly challenging. Their situation has in many cases, in addition, led to displacement, family separations, loss of jobs and livelihoods. We are ready to continue our investigations. We are aware of the multiplicity of efforts carried out by many organisations in this regard. The Commission reiterates its call for coordination of the efforts on this important matter in order to achieve meaningful results. Thank you for your attention. The words there of Commissioner Pablo de Grief of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine to the Security Council on Monday. Now, they speak for themselves. I will add no more except to say thank you again to the UN for emailing this podcast directly to point us to the report. You know my views on the UN. Now is not the time to rehearse them. I'm very impressed with that report. And if you want to have a go at me. Fine. I have no problem with that. But if you are a Russian official listening, an apologist for a Russian official, Russian troll, Russian adjacent troll, anything of that ilk, don't have a go at me, chaps. Go and have a look at that UN report. That's the United Nations report. Now, what happens next, I will take great interest in, but I think it is exemplary work by that UN panel, and I commend you all to go and have a look at the report. I abridged it there for time. Well done, the UN. And that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thanks, Dom. That is a sobering and terrifying report indeed. Francis is up in Scotland for the next couple of days, so the diplomatic updates fall on me today. And it is a big day because Starmer arrived in Kyiv this morning. It's the first time that the Prime Minister goes to Ukraine since taking office in July. That has ruffled some feathers in Kyiv, we'll get back to that. And he is bringing in his suitcase a crucial treaty that will tie the UK and Ukraine for the next century. So what has Starmer been up to since he arrived this morning? He has visited a burns treatment centre for both military personnel and civilian victims. He has gone to lay flowers at the Wall of Remembrance with President Zelensky. And at the time we're recording this podcast, they are currently in the Mariinsky Palace discussing said treaty. So what does the partnership include? It involves further military aid, including collaboration on maritime security and drone technology, as well as, and I quote, lethal aid. The details of what that entails have not yet been made clear. The UK has also been working on a database to trace Ukrainian grain that was stolen and sold by Russia since the beginning of the war. It's called the Grain Verification Scheme. The UK has been working on that for a while now, and that will be delivered to Kyiv in the coming weeks. And stronger economic and cultural ties with talks of collaboration on healthcare especially, as well as on education projects. Starmer is set to visit a school in Kyiv today, and they will dial into a call with a school in Liverpool. Also on the agenda, conversations about the current frontline and whether it should become a buffer zone should negotiation talks open. Obviously, at the top of Zelensky's wish list is joining NATO, and finally, sending peacekeeper troops to the country as a security guarantee, something that Starmer and President Macron of France have discussed in their meeting last week. Our political editor Ben Riley-Smith reported yesterday in the Telegraph that it seems that the UK hasn't yet completely signed up to the idea, and they're considering whether that could be seen as escalatory by Russia. One government source told him, "We are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. We're not there yet." Now, the timing of Starmer's visit to Kyiv is obviously of the essence. It happens just days before Trump returns to the White House with more power than ever. It's sending a strong signal across Europe as well as across the Atlantic on where the UK stands at a very sensitive time. The wider context of that visit is that officials in Kyiv have expressed frustrations over the last few months over the Labour administration and what they consider to be a more cautious approach to supporting Ukraine. Bloomberg yesterday even talked of disappointment as Starmer took a more low-profile approach in the footsteps of the Biden administration and some European leaders. Zelensky's team has complained about why it took more than 6 months for the new premier to visit Kyiv, which is much longer than his predecessors. Johnson visited a month after the invasion and Rishi Sunak 2 months after taking office. Labour's answer to that has been that they have kept on providing storm shadows and replenishing stocks ever since taking office, and that this visit builds on the £12.8 billion of support that the UK has already given to Ukraine, and they have committed to giving the country £3 billion in military aid for every year, quote, as long as it takes. I'll end on the comments released by Number 10 about Starmer's visit to Ukraine this morning. Putin's ambition to wrench Ukraine away from its closest partners has been a monumental strategic failure. Instead, we're closer than ever, and this partnership will take that friendship to the next level. Obviously, we'll be talking a lot more about that partnership in the next few days and what exactly that entails. Now to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. What do you make of this 100-year partnership, Hamish?
Adélie, Dom, hi. Really good to be back on the pod. It was exactly a week ago I was speaking to you from Syria, today on the slightly less rarefied atmosphere of Salisbury Plain. And yeah, absolutely looking at Starmer's visit to Kyiv today, but also looking at the ceasefire talk and the involvement in British troops in any ceasefire arrangement. And I suppose I will come back to Syria in my final thoughts. But why is there so much activity at the moment? Well, obviously, as you mentioned, Adélie, we've got our own Prime Minister in Kyiv at the moment. As you mentioned, he's recently been discussing the ceasefire and the use of British and French troops with President Macron. John Healey, the UK Defence Secretary, has hinted that British troops and the ceasefire are being talked about. So why are we so adamant that a ceasefire is on the horizon? Well, I think everybody knows that President Trump takes up the baton on Monday. And one of the key things that he has been saying is that he will sort the war in Ukraine out in 24 hours. And he has said that he will impose a ceasefire, which he probably has the military and political heft to do that. But it's not going to be quite as straightforward as that. I think the other things that are very relevant to this is obviously the ceasefire that we're hoping is going to take hold in Gaza from Sunday. He's had his hands on that, but not probably as much as he would like. The other key element to it is Syria, the demise of Assad and the Russian failure there. So it's sort of building up to what might happen. Why is this sort of UK on the front foot here? Well, both Trump and Boris Johnson, our previous Prime Minister, have also been discussing UK involvement. And as you've discussed, this 100-year deal is probably not the right word, but agreement that Starmer is pushing in Ukraine. And also, Ukraine is probably far more important to us from a defense and security perspective as it is the US. And with Trump rather wanting to sit back and let the European NATO countries do the heavy lifting, then somebody has to come to the fore. Is it a good idea that Britain's heavily involved? Basically, yes, but there are some big elephants in the room. And I also wrote a piece in the Telegraph yesterday saying how this might happen and what are the mechanics. Joe Barnes also wrote a piece yesterday, quite a detailed piece of the various options of peacekeeping and peace enforcement. I think both Dom and I did this a little bit in Bosnia back in the 90s, so we have a bit of practical experience. So, Britain is ideally placed to do it. The big elephant in the room is actually troops involved to do it. And we've discussed many times that we have taken great risks with the British military, really since the end of the Cold War. And we are at the smallest size we've been since Battle of Waterloo, I think, in numbers terms. Obviously, things have changed greatly. And I think everybody's well aware there's a strategic defence review ongoing at the moment. But I don't suppose within that consideration, they're looking at the requirements to provide a very large peacekeeping, peace enforcement force. In today's digital and drone-infested world, actually, we still need enough soldiers and equipment to do things like peace enforcement that we're talking about here. Let's not forget, the border is 800 miles long. In order to have a proper ceasefire, you do need both sides to agree to it, and that's key there. And once you've got agreement, you need a peacekeeping force that has the heft and capability in order to keep both sides apart. I think from a Ukraine perspective, I am sure if they agree, they will be compliant, because Zelensky will not want to upset the club he wants to join, and that is NATO. And from the Russian perspective, they again must respect the force on the ground. And although I don't expect US forces will be directly involved, I'm sure whatever agreement is made, that Trump must make it absolutely clear that the US will get heavily involved kinetically, as in with real force, if the Russians transgress. Putin is wise enough to realize that actually, if the US did that, that really would be absolutely the end of things. I think looking at, how many troops do you need to cover an 800-mile border? Well, a heck of a lot, potentially. I mean, having said that, intelligence assets, drones included, et cetera, will help police that border. You can't have soldiers covering every blade of grass of 800 miles. You require tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them. The force anyway is going to need to be fairly large, and you need to cover the ground in some form and be able to react. So when we talk about Britain being involved, I think the discussion is more about Britain being involved as a framework nation with command and control, and presumably discussions with the French about having French brigades and battle groups involved in some sort of reaction force, as well as British ones, potentially also Scandinavian and other NATO countries. The force in total could be sort of in the tens of thousands, but one will have to see the details. So it could be very considerable indeed. purely looking from a British perspective, when we only have an army of 70,000 and potentially we would be deploying 10 or so thousand troops at any one time to cover this, that actually uses up pretty much the whole of the British Army. Now, the Royal Air Force will be involved patrolling the skies, and potentially the Royal Navy patrolling the Black Sea as well. So this could be a considerable deployment for the British military, and actually allowing them to do pretty much little else. I expect the Estonia battle group would have to be redeployed into Ukraine as well. When it comes to roulement, in other words, changing troops, we generally in the British military only go on what we call operational tours for 6 months at a time. The Americans do 12 months. Having done both, from an achievement perspective, actually 12 months is better for continuity, et cetera, than 6 months. But, I expect there'll be many British soldiers sort of stabbing my portrait at the moment by suggesting any longer than 6 months tours. But that is another issue. And you've got to sort of think about roulement too. Other issues coming up here about, the defence budget. We know it's only 2.2% at the moment. Talk about increasing 2.5 in inverted commas when the conditions allow. Usually when we go on operations like this, it's not the defence budget that pays for it, but the Treasury. Ms. Reeves is going to have to dig deep into her pockets if the government agrees that this is going to happen. On the US here, I've said we would need their kinetic heft, their firepower in the background to deter particularly the Russians. I'm sure we'd also need their intelligence assets. I'm slightly discounting US forces on the ground because that is the mood music coming out of Trump at the moment, so one assumes. And I suppose, the sort of final bit here, although the MOD have been quite tight-lipped, as you said, Adélie, quoting some of the other pieces in the paper yesterday, I am sure an awful lot of contingency planning is going on to make sure that if on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday next week, Trump does pull this hopefully amazing rabbit out of the hat, then things can happen, because it's not an inconsequential task of, say, moving 10,000 British soldiers and airmen, etc., from the UK or where they are to Ukraine and getting the whole thing set up. It will take considerable time. But if you've done the planning in detail to begin with, then it's going to be a lot easier. So I assume all that sort of stuff is happening. So in sum, is it likely that the UK will be involved in producing some sort of force to patrol a ceasefire? Yeah, I think it is pretty likely. All the music and the fact that Starmer's in Kyiv at the moment sort of indicates that. Can the British military do it? Well, they can, but they won't be able to do a lot else. From a soldier's perspective, and I don't know what Dom thinks, I would be excited. I think this is a really important strategic role for the British military. And if I was a soldier in the British military at the moment, I'd be really excited. So I think it is a good thing. I think it's going to be an awful lot in the detail, very complex. But at the beginning of 2025, being a bit depressed with what's happening, looking at the moment, things are looking a lot more positive. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. I think, Dom, you have a few questions for Hamish, but first of all, would you be excited about joining a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine, as Hamish asked?
Excited? Well, yeah, I suppose so. It beats hanging around in the shot, I guess. No, I think they'd be massively up for this. They always complain, soldiers always complain. We always used to complain that we were overworked, underpaid, undersexed, all that kind of stuff, and then would say, yeah, let's go and do the next thing, the next sort of problem spot. So I don't doubt there'd be huge enthusiasm to go and do this. Whether or not they'd actually be able to, as Hamish says, with the requirement, as in the force you've got out there, the one you've got preparing to go, and the one you've got recovering from. Oh, and then everything else the British Army likes to get up to, whether or not they could do is something else entirely, another question. A couple of points, if I may, Hamish. Firstly, on the framing of this, we had a really lovely email from Eli Tenenbaum. He's the Director of Security Studies, or the Security Studies Centre at the Institut Français des Relations Internationales, which I think is something to do with international relations in France. He made the point that we shouldn't start to frame this as a peacekeeping force. He said that is the wrong way of thinking about it, too passive almost. He was saying it should be referred to as a guarantor force, to guarantee whatever undoubtedly UN-sponsored agreement was made. It's a much more active, more aggressive, if you like, but certainly a more active phraseology and descriptor for the force. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And secondly, just to kick off, In terms of who would do it, and yeah, the Trump administration incoming seems to have made noises that they wouldn't be up for putting American boots on the ground. I wonder if this could be a mission for the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, the 10-nation sort of Northern European grouping that hasn't really done anything yet, done a lot of exercises. It's starting to do this thing in the Baltic Sea, which seems more AI and computer-driven than actual hard, heavy metal being thrown at a problem. So I wonder if JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which the UK is one of the framework nations, would want to try and get involved here. Just wondered what your thoughts are on those two, Hamish.
Tom, yeah, good point there. I agree that this is more of a peace enforcement force, which is more sort of Bosnia, although I know that the Bosnian operation turned from a UN sort of peacekeeping operation to a NATO peace enforcement plus type operation. So, yeah, no, I agree, absolutely. Whatever force goes in there needs some heavy metal, not just tanks, but aircraft and all the other wherewithal to be able to actually stop any incursions that I say the Russians might do, because I'm sort of assuming that Ukraine's not going to take advantage. So absolutely, it needs to be a force with a bit of bulk and muscle behind it. Yeah, on to the command and control piece. Absolutely, the JEF. I was seeing some people from the ARC, the Ace Rapid Reaction Corps, based just down the road from me. They're itching to get involved. But yes, I think your point is that there is not a British sort of command and control structure that could do it on its own, but some sort of NATO type like the JEF strikes me, and I'm sure those are the ones that are doing it. If Trump is taken to the letter of what he's saying and everybody else and wants the Brits to be leading it as such, it might be a JEF framework, perhaps with the major headquarters being the ARC headquarters that is British heavy. But we shall see. But there does seem to be a determination across European NATO countries to get involved. And it would appear some of the backroom work, like the Macron meeting and others, is going on. And from what people are telling me, that a lot of planning and effort is going into this.
Yes, undoubtedly so. A couple more, if I may. I was looking at this 100-year deal between Ukraine and UK, and Adélie and I were chatting earlier on, and I was trying to work out actually who on the face of it, who's going to get most out of it right now. Because if we accept that the only security guarantee in town is Article 5, then you can have a 100-year deal or 200-year deal. Is that actually going to do anything if push really does come to shove? And if you look at the detail of the document, and we've only seen it in the last hour or so, but it's saying that the UK will be Ukraine's energy partner. It's going to cement the relationship of energy. I think it's mixing a number of metaphors there, but and I just wondered if that's what this is all about, really. And this is warm words, and there's no suggestion that Britain would row back on its commitment under the last Conservative administration and this current Labour government of supporting Ukraine to the tune of £3 billion a year, plus the gifting of military aid. No suggestion that's going to be rowed back on. But I just wonder, looking at this deal, whether UK is actually getting more out of it sort of now or in the very near future, if there's a lot more to be done with collaboration about innovation, tech, AI, drones and energy, than Britain would provide Ukraine above and beyond what it's already doing.
Yeah, Dom, I think you and Adélie are probably absolutely right. I mean, it does seem a bit odd. Why call it a 100-year deal? I mean, one is assuming in whatever time frame that Ukraine will become part of NATO. Therefore, the sort of security and defence arrangements talked in it are sort of slightly analogous. And when it comes to the power infrastructure, again, it does seem a little bit odd. Maybe this is a bit of detail work that's been done in the sort of back rooms of Westminster by somebody really to try and, as Adélie said at the very beginning here, the timing of this is a little bit strange. But obviously, Starmer wants to get a big bang out of it. And the headline in our paper and other papers of a 100-year deal is there. But I agree, the substance behind it, one is not entirely sure. And quite frankly, I don't think it really matters. What really matters is what's going to happen over probably the next 12 to 24 months than anything deeper in the future than that. And the key thing there is to get a just peace and ceasefire that Ukraine can live with. I'm sure Zelensky's not thinking what's happening in 10 years' time and beyond. So, yeah, I agree. It's to me, it's a little bit of a headline grabber rather than any deep and meaningful long-term commitment to Ukraine. Over.
Yeah, I'm just on that last point. I'm seeing some information now from the Kyiv Independent. There's so this document they've signed, this deal is 10 pillars, 10 main pillars. So there's some other pillars as well, smaller pillars. What do you call a small pillar? Don't know. But the 10 main pillars are, number 1, strengthening defence capabilities. OK, that's happening already. Number 2, supporting Ukraine's NATO aspirations. Yep, happening already. Number 3, maritime security partnership. Difficult in the guise of what can and cannot happen at the moment in the Black Sea and the movement of Ukrainian, any naval assets in and out. Number 4, trade cooperation. 5, energy cooperation. 6, justice and accountability cooperation. Then 7, jointly countering foreign information manipulation and interference. Fine. Number 8, science and technology cooperation. 9, harnessing socio-cultural ties. Great. And number 10, migration cooperation. So I'm just looking at that list now. We're not going to answer it here, but I just wonder how many of those are of benefit to Ukraine right now, above and beyond what's already happening. How many of those might be of benefit to the UK right now? Anyway, a moot point. My last one, Hamish, if I may. I wonder if the comms around this has been good, if it wasn't leaked. We didn't hear about it in advance. We knew he was going, but didn't know the detail, which in many ways is a good thing. However, some images from the train on his way in, Prime Minister Keir Starmer. There was a touch of the Macrons, can we call it that? He was wearing a black T-shirt and looking very very roughy-toughy. Now he's back in a suit here in Kyiv. Other images there. So rather, I suppose, a bit of a flippant question. But do you think it's a good look to see your national leader, if you're not Zelensky, and it's been your thing since day one of the full-scale invasion, but national leaders going into Ukraine suddenly getting stuck into the sort of Bruce Willis muscle vest type look?
Tom, yeah, no, I saw that. No, I don't think it is. I think it's a dreadful look. Had he been an ex-soldier or something like that, fine. But, we know what Starmer is. His background as a lawyer. So a sort of looky-likey with Zelensky, yeah, I think he should not try and create a persona that he really isn't. I do, I respect him going there, and I think it's the right thing. But his spin doctors who are around him, yeah, I think they sort of dropped one there. That wasn't a good look. He's much more compelling when he's in his suit and his red tie, strutting around Kyiv, I think, than as you say, trying to do the Bruce Willis. And the final bit on your 10 pillars, Starmer or the new organisation in Westminster, rather keen on their pillars. Maybe that's the latest business speak or whatever coming out of think tanks and universities these people came from. But it just strikes me that those are the sort of things you do with allies and friendly nations anyway, isn't it? Maybe it's stating the obvious. Maybe we haven't been as close to Ukraine as we should have been in the past, which is why we're now in the position that we are. But let's hope that things are looking brighter with the Trump sunshine coming up on Monday at some stage.
Thanks, Hamish. While in Kyiv, Francis sat down with Adam Sybera, a senior research analyst at the Kyiv Independent, to discuss a subject rarely talked about beyond corruption, organised crime, both in Ukraine and Russia, and how they've adapted since the beginning of the war.
My name is Adam Sybera. I work as a senior research analyst in the Kyiv Independent-backed think tank, KI Insights. And currently I focus on the Ukrainian and Eastern European crime scene and impacts of war on it.
Perhaps you could start, first of all, by summarising the criminal scene before the war in Ukraine.
Well, criminal scene before or up until the full-scale invasion in February 2022. So a lot of it was sort of interacting between the Belarusian gangs, the Russian Mafia, and the Ukrainian organized crime. However, the big difference is that Russia and Belarus, the criminal scene is sort of incorporated into the state. There are borders and limits, and there is competition. So it's not, let's say, a hierarchical system, but which is important to differentiate. But it differentiates from Ukraine, because Ukraine, you have the criminal underworld, maybe sometimes linked to the oligarchy, and the state. Whether Russia and Belarus, to a certain extent, they function as a kleptocracy, and all of these, let's say, big players, they either have to cooperate or are allowed to function on the market.
Broadly speaking, summarise how the full-scale invasion changes the criminal scene in this country.
Well, the most obvious things that comes to mind, so let's say if you look at the siege of the Black Sea, so obviously that disrupts a lot of the smuggling routes. Odessa ports were, up until the full-scale invasion, used as a big crime hub for Eastern Europe, whether it is smuggling narcotics from countries like Afghanistan into Europe, which obviously the full-scale invasion made impossible to do because of the presence of the Black Sea Fleet.
Interesting.
Another big thing is also sanctions. Belarusian organizations and Russian organizations are under sanctions. Ukrainians are not.
Interesting. And I imagine too that you would say perhaps weapons production?
Weapons 100%. Obviously, due to a presence of war, there's a big amount of weapons coming in from both sides. It's not so much about the weapons that you get from the state or from your army, but about trophy weapons, which then are either, stolen and sold down further. If you look at some countries, especially in Kaliningrad, is Russia. But in these areas, a lot of crime, which involves weapons like firearms, increased since the beginning of full-scale invasion, which would suggest the presence of weapons that got in there from perhaps trophy weapons or from Ukraine and battlegrounds in the country.
So talk me through the cost of criminality, both for Russia and for Ukraine, in terms of fighting this war.
Well, with any data that comes from Russia, you have to be very cautious because it's usually manipulated. But if you look, for instance, at the Wagner PMC group, which mobilizes within the criminal networks, and people like, I think his name is Little Shark, it's Zakhar Kalashov, I think, right now. And he was one of the original Vore. He was jailed in Russia, and he was one of the figures who helped with mobilization of criminals into the army. Then these criminals would get a deal to survive 6 months and then be released back into Russia. I mean, again, we don't have precise numbers from Russia or numbers that we can 100% say they're correct, because there's more than a high chance that they're manipulated. But there are instances where those criminals return and then participate in crime in the country again.
Could you say then, therefore, that in the Russian context, the criminal elements actually boost the state more than they hinder it in its war?
I don't know if boost the state, but again, if we come back to the premise that Russia essentially to an extent works as a kleptocratic syndicate or a kleptocratic state, and participates and has a big history of participating either with Vore or organized crime, this is another level, or let's say evolution, of the crime scene that has been going on there for 20 plus years.
Fascinating. So let's look at Ukraine then. What are the costs of criminality for Ukraine in fighting this war?
The criminality in Ukraine changed in the sense that it created new opportunities. For instance, people smuggling, whether it is trying to, being paid off by someone who doesn't want to get mobilized and getting him into Europe. And the weapons we were talking about, also there was this big smuggling network into Russia and into Ukraine, which is now impossible to participate in it because there's a front running right through it and you can't pass anything through there. So you would have to create new smuggling routes and new opportunities for, it's like, if I'm being cynical, it's business as anything other. If you lose one opportunity, you look for another ones.
And so when we think of criminality, quite often the term that's associated with that most commonly in the Ukraine example is corruption. Can you talk about that connection between corruption and criminality?
I mean, if you look at corruption, yes, it's very difficult to sometimes report about Ukraine without hitting the topic of corruption. But at the same time, if you look at the last 2 years and the amount of whether it is financial opportunities or how much weapons come in, obviously some corruption will increase because the opportunities increase. This would, in my opinion, happen in any other country as well.
Of course. So when we think then, we've broken it down by criminality and how it impacts Russia, criminality and how it impacts Ukraine. Are they totally severed? Are the criminal elements, you talked about the connections between Russia, Belarus, and Russia's connections on crime, but are there still connections between Ukraine, Russia, and people who are just profiting from war?
That is very interesting and something I would like to know more about as well. However, I read recently a really interesting article from The Economist where they interviewed one of these, he was anonymous, but if Economist has their sources right, he was part of the Ukrainian criminal scene. And he said an interesting line that it's one thing to be remembered as a criminal, another thing to be remembered as a traitor. So to an extent, a lot of it was severed. But always look at Mafia and organized crime, they're pragmatic, they're largely apolitical. If there's a situation which they're calculating, they don't know how the war ends. So they're trying to put themselves in the safest possible position. And if they're forced, or because, the situation is what it is, to operate on Ukrainian ground, they have to be more inclined to work with the Ukrainian state, obviously.
Criminality is often being weaponized in this war. One sees it in Western capitals particularly, and in Washington particularly, as a means to justify inaction in support of Ukraine. Do you think that overeggs the influence of crime and corruption in this country?
I think now if we look at Russian propaganda often uses the topic of crime and corruption exactly to achieve that position.
Yes.
Again, I'll come back to what I said a couple of minutes ago, that corruption is present in every democratic country. Yes, Ukraine has its bigger history with it, and the war brought in new opportunities. But in this sense, I would maybe make like a little analogy that, you cut your nails, they're going to grow back. And the war enables the nails to grow faster for you, if I'm making sense right now. But then if we look at the scale of things, of what's at stake in the war against West, Russia is leading with its allies. I think it would be very unwise to consider corruption and criminality generated by the war to be a reason to stop help, or using it as an excuse to not help or help less.
And who are these people, whether it be in the Russian example of Mafia, whether it be in the Ukrainian example? Are these people who've been associated with crime, whether it be oligarchs and their minions for decades? Are they a nouveau riche of criminal? Are they educated? Are they uneducated? Maybe you can't generalize, but just interested in who these people are.
Yes, there's examples which I can mention, So for instance, if you look at Nicholls, who was one of the original vory v zákoně or thieves-in-law, and who started the Solntsevskaya Bratva. Currently, he has an official position within the Russian state as an advisor to President of Union of Veterans of the Special Military Operation. So this is a clear example of how some of these, high-profile thieves-in-law are suddenly incorporated into the state. And this goes to others like Semyon Mogilevich. But Semyon Mogilevich is exactly what you're talking about, where there's a lot of suspicion that many of his financial networks actually then finance oligarchy or help finance projects of Eastern oligarchs in Central and Eastern Europe. Now we get into really complicated topics, but if you look, for instance, the problem of oligarchy in Central and Eastern Europe and how they have influence on politics, and the big trend of their politics suddenly being inclined to lean towards the official policies of Russian foreign ministry, we get into a topic to which extent the most powerful criminal networks can actually help Russia in pushing their agenda beyond its borders.
And there's a lot of talk, of course, about war and criminality, but what about peace and criminality? Let's say, and I know this is a huge if, but let's say the war ends in 6 months, there's some sort of frozen line, and then the West can begin to invest. Who knows what's going to happen? But if we do get to that point, what aspect do you think the criminal elements will have as part of the reconstruction, or do you think that this will be an enormous project as the West invests more to purge this from Ukrainian society?
Reconstruction is obviously an interesting topic, because if there is a peace deal or a ceasefire of sorts, I think reconstruction is going to be one of the biggest, money incomes into the country. And obviously there will be white collar crime and, different financiers linked perhaps to the criminal underworld, which will try to take advantage of it. But if we look at crime in a strict sense, what I think will be interesting and something we should be focusing on is because these smuggling routes I was talking about, and for instance, what we haven't mentioned at all, so a lot of technology is sanctioned to going into Russia. And these smuggling routes are not just about narcotics, but about getting technology into Russia. And this creates competition. And if there's some sort of ceasefire or a peace deal, likely some of these original smuggling routes might be restored, so which creates more competition between the criminal networks. And when criminal networks compete, there's usually, a tendency for either violence or more criminal behavior. I don't think they're going to get better.
Probably an obvious question, but reporting on this kind of work, it's an unusual area. Are there risks attached to you?
I would assume so. I have my own history with reporting on oligarchs in Central Europe. I'm from the Czech Republic. And to be completely honest, just so I have a calmer sleep, I try not to think about it too much.
Yeah, right. And anything that we haven't talked about that you think is relevant and of interest to listeners globally who may not be aware of the criminal context in Europe and the complex history of it, or anything else that's on your mind?
I really do like the topic of oligarchy, and I think it's sometimes separated from a criminal network. When we talk about crime, we always see rogue gangs doing drug deals and things like that, dealing arms. A lot of the crime throughout the years and throughout, let's say, the criminal tendencies Russia has, and how their state is designed, sort of morphed into something, especially in Eastern Europe. We accepted more that, these people who were generated by wild 90s and by blatant financial schemes are now full-on oligarchs. And for instance, in Czech Republic, the likely next prime minister is one of these people who both has history with the Secret Service of Russia, and in the 90s, a lot of, let's say, shady deals that are linked or where he directly interacts with these people. We sometimes forget what environment generated these people and what danger they can pose to our democracies.
Well, as you say, we have a political elite and we also have a criminal elite, as it were,
Yes.
and they blend, they're transnational,
Yes.
and they blend countries. And so it will be fascinating
Yes.
to see how that evolves, particularly as we enter this next phase of this war and looking at the reconstruction of Ukraine and how that plays in. I can imagine that the spotlight is really going to zoom in on this, because there's no way that Western countries are going to feel comfortable investing, one, if the security guarantees aren't in place that they know that the war is securely stopped, and two, if they feel that there's going to be systematic corruption, which means that they're not going to be able to get their profits.
Exactly, as you say. Sometimes the line between these financial elites and the criminal elites can be thinner than it seems at first sight, and that's why it's particularly important on how this war ends, because if it's some blind peace deal and these people are allowed to function in, let's say, their old tracks, they're more likely to increase their operations and their pressure on what's been working out for them. I mean, if you negotiate with someone holding a knife to you and it works out for him, what incentive does he have to not do it anymore?
Right, and that's applicable in so many different circumstances at the moment. One final question, of course, we're talking about the attempts by future governments, whether it be Western or in Ukraine, to crack down on criminality because of the end of the war. But of course, it's happening right now, this attempted crackdown. Zelensky's been very vocal, perhaps knowing that the importance of being seen to tackle this historic issue, which was, as we've talked about, very closely associated with Russia and its control over Ukraine. This is not all homegrown. Has it been working? Has it been effective? If you look at the last sort of 2-3 years of war and the efforts that have been made to stamp out corruption here.
To give you an answer, as much as I sometimes may be critical to Zelensky regarding to this classic oligarch scheme that everyone sort of looks at or looks through at Ukraine with, Kolomoisky is in jail, so that didn't happen before. So yes, there will be some progress, but it's also how much of it is Zelensky and how much of it, let's say, this survival instinct, because European Union laid out pretty straightforward 7-step plan, and one of them is the oligarchization of the country in order to proceed with ascension to the European Union. And I think everyone in Ukraine is aware that the European Union and NATO is the biggest security guarantees they can do, which means they're essentially forced to go down this way, which is definitely a good thing. But as I said, the war also creates new and various opportunities, and I'm pretty sure the oligarchs are aware of this and will try to take advantage of them as well.
Well, no doubt because of that, we will be returning to this subject. It'd be fascinating to have you back on.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation.
To our final thoughts, Hamish, do you want to start?
Thanks very much. As I alluded to the beginning, my final thoughts are really Syria and how this all fits in here. And having spent so much time in northwest Syria during the war, and then having been in Syria myself last week, ostensibly with people that I supported in northwest Syria, I left very, very upbeat, really excited that Syria has the opportunity to become a democratic, secular and moderate country, which I'm sure a lot of people listening to this might be really surprised at. It's all intimately involved in what we're talking about, what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine. And I know, having written various pieces and trying to raise this, in the media generally in the last few days, it is very difficult to get Syria on the agenda because of everything else happening. But as I wrote in my piece last week while I was in Syria, Syria has this opportunity. The British Syrian diaspora are so influential in the new government administration. in Damascus, that we could make a really profound difference. And with the state threats hopefully diminishing with a ceasefire in Ukraine coming up, and with the terror threats hopefully diminishing with a ceasefire in Gaza, the other column to this is it very much Syria and making sure that the jihadists, the Islamic State and everything else doesn't regrow and regroup in Syria, which is a possibility if we do not advise, help and support the new Syrian government. So with everything else going on that's looking positive, I just hope we don't drop the Syrian ball, which could be a really marvellous back to the great Syrian country it was before the Assad family destroyed it over the last 50 years or so. That is my final thought and wish for 2025 as well.
Thank you. And over to you, Dom. It's not Easter yet, but I think you've got something yummy for us.
Yeah, I want to talk about chocolate. And thank you to John and others for raising this. So John emailed ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. He said, quite, in Sweden, there is a brand of chocolate called Marabou. They are the Cadburys of Sweden. They're owned by Mondelez, I think it's pronounced Mondelez, who continue to operate in Russia. There is a local campaign here against them where dedicated shop owners label them with Russian flag warning signs, and the Swedish king has stripped them of the right to bear the royal seal. This Marabou brand is unfortunately currently advertising itself in conjunction with the Ukraine the Latest podcast. Thanks, John. Thanks to others for pointing this out. I just want to say, so we have the way that our tech's set up, we have unfortunately no say over the adverts. We don't know who they are. We don't pick the adverts that are played during the podcast. I had a look into this, though, and Mondelez, as you raise it, and I note actually that in December just gone, Cadbury, chocolate maker Cadbury, that's in the family, in the Mondelez family, was dropped from the royal list of warrants here by King Charles. Been on it for 170 years, but got dropped in December. Anyway, so I approached Mondelez for comment, tried to get hold of them this morning. I've heard nothing back. If anyone from the company is listening, you are very welcome to come on this podcast and put your side of the story as to why you're still continuing business inside Russia. But yeah, just to recap, sorry, we do not control the adverts, but thank you, John and others, for emailing us. As I say, we do read every message. We try and act on them when we can, reply where we can, and I will follow that story up if I'm able to. If I get a response from Mondelez, they're very welcome to come on.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, or Foreign Affairs newsletter, bringing stories from award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine, the latest, as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review. It really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly with us to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.